Frederick Trump doesn't cross the border, he flees it. A young German in 1885, desperately falsifying papers, escaping military service while America's immigration gates stand temporarily open. No citizenship papers, just opportunity. Fast forward. It's 1899 in the frozen Yukon wilderness. The same man now stands in the doorway of his establishment, the new Arctic restaurant and hotel, smiling as miners with gold dust-stained fingers stumble in. Inside, beyond the dining room, lies his true business. A maze of private rooms where exhausted, lonely men find comfort with women charging by the hour. The cash register rings. This immigrant fugitive isn't just running a business. He's building a fortune in brothels and booze that will someday finance an American dynasty. The grandfather of a future American president didn't cross the border legally to achieve the American dream. He snuck across it to sell flesh and whiskey. You saw that opening and felt the gravity. That violent contrast of fugitives selling whiskey and comfort in the snow is not what most history classes teach. What follows, for many, is a much cleaner story. The family textbook version, the brochure narrative, the tidy origin myth. Now we rewind to the version everyone is taught and lay it out in bright, reassuring colors the story that will soon come apart. In schoolbooks and celebratory lectures, Frederick Trump becomes Frederick Trump, the model immigrant. The narration runs like a polished exhibit. A 16-year-old leaves a small German village in 1885, arrives in America full of promise, learns English, apprentices as a barber, and sets out into the frontier with nothing but a work ethic and a pocket of savings. He opens restaurants and hotels in hard places. He serves miners hearty meals, offers shelter from the cold, and performs the humble civic duty of providing services where none existed. He saves his money and invests prudently in Seattle real estate. Later he returns to New York, raises a family, and leaves a legacy of industry and respectability. The moral is simple: follow the rules, work hard, and the country rewards you. Hear the voices that built this version. A history teacher on a local public television special says, he showed what a determined immigrant could do in America. A broadsheet profile from a conservative magazine hails him as a pioneer of hospitality who met the needs of men living and working on the frontier. And in a best-selling memoir a generation later, a son writes in soft tones, "My grandfather taught us to seize opportunity the right way." These are the tidy lines that circulate in speeches, in campaign literature, in the family's own retellings. Visually, the official version is comfortable. Picture a postage stamp portrait of a young man in sensible clothes, a sepia photograph of a storefront with a neat sign, a map showing a short, respectable migration from the Atlantic coast up to the Yukon and back. The soundtrack is steady, fiddles and patriotic light. The shots linger on hands learning a trade, on a ledger balanced, on a house in suburbia where children grow up safe. There is almost no dirt under the fingernails in this film. Inconvenient details are edited out. Why would such a sanitized story stick? Because it serves as a moral engine. It props up a narrative that certain political projects needed, that immigrants who do it right succeed and deserve a place at the table, that lawfulness and sobriety are the only routes to respectability. This version is comforting not only for families who want a clean lineage, but for political voices that use a single ancestral example to frame entire debates about borders and civic obligation. Who wins from that comfort? Consider the stakeholders. Real estate interests gain moral cover when wealth is claimed as the product of honest work instead of vice. Political actors use the tale as rhetorical armor, arguing that merit and paperwork are gateways to belonging. Publishers and media outlets find in the story a marketable trope, the immigrant who becomes a businessman. Each retelling smooths a rough edge, and the repetition grants the story civic authority. It becomes part of how communities imagine themselves. Listen to how the official lines sound when reduced to slogans. He came legally, learned English, worked hard. A model immigrant who played by the rules. Those sentences function like talismans. They are short, repeatable, and morally convenient. When used in campaigns, they do heavy lifting, compressing complex histories into proof texts for policy and identity. Yet, even in this neat telling, there are soft spots. Dates that sit unexamined, places that are flatter than the lives they describe, the tendency to translate every frontier vice into a polite euphemism. The official narrative is not a neutral account. It is an edited memory crafted for acceptance. You learned it in a textbook. You heard it in political speeches. It feels right. But good stories are not always true ones. Before we turn the page, pause. The apparently certain arrival, the carefully cataloged businesses, the smooth return home, all of it will be tested against documents, local gossip, and the dirt of everyday life. In the next section, we begin to pry into every seam of that official cloth. The small discrepancies add up faster than you expect. And when they do, the whole story shifts. Thank you for staying with this investigation so far. If you're watching and you care about the histories we inherit, consider subscribing. This channel is new, and every new subscriber helps us keep digging into stories the classroom skipped. We're aiming for 1,000 supporters to keep this work going. If you value uncovering what was left out, hit the button and join the conversation. The first crack in the family portrait is a detail that looks, at first glance, almost trivial: a military list in a Bavarian archive. Names, dates, assignments, a bureaucratic ledger that refuses to conform to a neat origin story. The ledger shows Frederick Trump of Karlstadt as someone who did not simply plan to seek opportunity. It shows a young man who disappeared from the roster, who never turned up to fulfill a civic duty that the state expected. That absence is a small black mark. In the tidy narrative, it is erased. But archives don't forget. This is our first fenda, a factual wedge driven under the comfortable plank of the official myth. Now imagine the scene. An archivist labeled the page in fading ink. The paper smells faintly of mildew and lamp oil. The entries were written with a steady hand. The camera lingers on the name. A narrator comments, "He left at 16. The voice is calm, almost apologetic. You think, a boy seeking better prospects. But the ledger tells another story, one of duty avoided, of a community's expectation unmet. That shift in motive from noble seeker to draft dodger changes the moral grammar beneath the rest of the tale. Move forward to the ports and harbors of the 1880s. Immigration in that era didn't resemble modern border control. There were few lines and fewer documents. People arrived by the thousands and, often, simply walked into towns. The official statement that he arrived legally is technically true only in the language of the present. It misunderstands the legal reality of that moment. In practice, his crossing was less a matter of adherence to a system than of exploiting an era of lax enforcement. This is the second fenda. The family slogan collapses when we compare it to how migration actually functioned at the time. The third fenda appears in the way his businesses were advertised. Town gazettes of Monte Cristo and later Yukon clerks did not always use the same euphemisms as generations of family retailers. Ads for hotels and restaurants often included the line "private rooms for ladies." In frontier slang, that phrase was rarely ambiguous. It promised services beyond food and lodging. When you line up the primary sources, the adverts, the ledgers, the licenses, a pattern emerges. The official map of respectable entrepreneurship does not match what contemporaneous documents explicitly advertised. Local police logs and health reports make the picture sharper. In small mining towns, inspectors wrote of sanitation problems, of illegal liquor sales, and of women operating rooms in the back. These are not anonymous accusations written decades later. These are municipal records, sometimes typed, sometimes hastily scrawled, filed near the tax ledgers. They reveal that his establishments were repeatedly implicated in the informal vice economy of the gold rush. The official biographical the departures themselves leave traces. Deeds transferred quickly, sales recorded at a premium, trunks of goods shipped away. Financial records and customs manifests suggest that he sent home more than small savings. There are references to hoarded coin and shipments that would be unusual for a mere restaurateur. These transactions, when set next to the unsympathetic municipal reports, sketch a portrait of deliberate extraction, a designed accumulation of capital from morally and legally dubious markets. Consider, too, the personal letters sent back to Karlstadt. They are circumspect, evasive in places. "Business is very good," he writes in German, with a few polite references to the comforts of American life. But the letters rarely mention the details that municipal records highlight. There is a dissonance between what he told his family and what the public records recorded. That silence is a form of self-editing. Presentable phrases that preserve reputation back home while the real money changes hands in the Yukon night. And then the decisive collision. His 1901 attempt to return to Germany as a wealthy son of America. The Bavarian authorities, having pulled the thread of his absence earlier in life, confronted him with the missing years. He applied to regain citizenship, to return as if nothing had happened. The state, armed with its own registers and its own sense of civic duty, saw a man who had evaded obligations. The result was deportation. The man left his old country behind and was sent back across the ocean, not as a triumphant returnee, but as an exile who had tried to enjoy the fruits of a life he had not fully justified in legal or moral terms. Think about that humiliation, to be foreign in your homeland because you refused to perform the duties it demanded. That reversal interrogates the entire tidy narrative. If he was cast out by the country of his birth, the claim that he was the model of legal, upright migration becomes impossible to maintain without contradiction. What do we make of motive? Here the evidence narrows but doesn't vanish. He left Germany to avoid military service. He declined, later, to take citizenship in the United States, rising and falling in both legal worlds in ways that suggest opportunism over allegiance. Historians must be cautious. Motivations are complex, personal. But the archival record ledgers, ads, municipal files, letters, deportation papers accumulates toward a coherent interpretation. His life in the American frontier was shaped by pragmatic pursuit of profit, sometimes in the shadow economy of vice. At this point, two interpretive dangers loom. One is overreach, turning biographical gaps into moral indictments without sufficient proof. The other is the opposite, flattening contradictions into a sentimentalism that makes everyone a hero. The material here sits in between, a mosaic of facts that, together, complicate the official portrait and force us to ask harder questions about lineage, legitimacy, and the origins of wealth. The fissures are not neat accusations of criminality in the headline sense. They are traces of a man who worked the edges of law and community for profit. We can read these fractures in visual sequences. Imagine the neat family portrait in a sitting room. A child points to the grandfather's polished face and repeats the story. Then cut to a black and white newspaper clipping with a headline about vice houses. Then to an inked ledger. Then to a deportation letter stamped with official ink. Each cut compounds the dissonance. When you compare the official myth against these documents, three things emerge. The motive was not solely noble. The businesses were not purely respectable, and the departures were calculated. The official story is, at best, incomplete, and at worst deliberately curated. This is where the first wave of doubt settles. Not as screaming revelation, but as cumulative pressure. Each piece, the draft avoidance, the private rooms, the complaints, the hurried sales, the deportation is a grain of sand that erodes the smooth statue of a model ancestor. The viewer is left not with a simple scandal, but with a more honest, more unsettling human figure, a man of his time whose actions reflect the ambiguities of frontier capitalism. And that is precisely why the official myth held such power for so long. It papered over contradictions that were embarrassing for descendants and politically useful for later generations. But the papering inevitably peels. The question that follows is not only what this man did, but what his story was used to justify later, a question that will lead us deeper into how memory is manufactured, how reputations are bought and sold, and how a family brand can be built on money that nobody quite wants to name aloud. Behind the tidy portrait in the family album, there were rooms that never made it into the frame. Narrow service corridors, a ledger with smudged entries, a back stair that creaked. Those are the places where the real business lived. Imagine the new Arctic restaurant at dusk, a single gas lamp through frosted glass, the scent of stew and hot grease in the front, and out back a different economy humming under a low ceiling. This is the engine the official histories omit. The front dining room was a stage. Miners arrived with frozen beards and gold dust on their cuffs. They ate warming meals, meat, potatoes, strong tea, prices that felt reasonable after days on a claim. The public face mattered. A respectable menu, a chalkboard with advertised fares, a clean table for a prospector who might later mention a name back east. That legitimacy bought cover. It supplied receipts and respectable conversation. It allowed the proprietor to say, honestly enough, restaurant and hotel. Behind that stage there was choreography. A waitress, often young, sometimes recently arrived, sometimes pressed into work by circumstance, moved through a door marked private. The phrase "private rooms for ladies," printed in a local paper or on a sign, was not a euphemism that needed translation for residents of boom towns. It was an advertisement. What those rooms offered: company, warmth, payment in coin or dust, was part of demand in places where women were rare and men were transient. The service was cash, immediate, high margin. The back rooms transformed fleeting desires into steady profit. You can picture the rules of the microeconomy. Liquor came at a premium. Shipping barrels of spirits out to the Yukon was expensive. That cost was passed on, often as hospitality surcharge. A miner who had discovered a few ounces of gold could afford to pay 3 or 4 times what the same bottle would cost in Seattle. The markup was not accidental. It underwrote other services and paid for protection. Suppliers who understood frontier margins became partners. They delivered when roads were cut by snow. Their invoices and the receipts tucked into trunks provide a paper trail of commerce that matches the story on the ground, not the family's later gloss. The proprietor's work was managerial and transactional. He hired women, some local, some recruited from towns that already had brothel cultures, and he set the terms. He negotiated with purveyors, with ship captains moving goods south, with the barkeep who kept the taps running. He listened to gossip and ruled disputes. He sometimes arranged discreet payments to local constables, not always called bribes in those small towns, but functioning the same way. A fee for inattention, an argument that it keeps the men from rioting in the streets. When enforcement seemed inevitable, he timed exits and sales so that profit left before prosecution arrived. Power in these towns was fluid. There were no well-established legal infrastructures. Magistrates rotated, and the line between legitimate entrepreneur and tolerated vice operator was negotiated continuously. Frederick's role was that of the negotiator. He built alliances with other businessmen who preferred peaceable commerce to noisy raids. He learned who to pay and when to placate. That practical diplomacy kept the front door open and the back rooms in operation. Not all earnings were clean coin. Miners paid in dust, in nuggets, in favors. The proprietor accepted exchange that mainland bankers might not recognize. Gold dust was weighed, wrapped, hidden in belts and trunks. Some of it crossed the border disguised in everyday goods. Customs manifests occasionally show odd shipments, barrels of kitchenware that, when unpacked, contained crates of coins. Those manifests are small, sharp clues. They are the kind of evidence you can't forever reduce to innocent transactions. The social cost of the enterprise is harder to count, but visible if you look. The family accepted the narrative because it preserved social standing and eased conversation with neighbors. There were morally ambiguous calculations embedded in every decision. When the local constable hinted that inspectors might visit, property titles were shuffled. Deeds were transferred, sometimes through proxies, sometimes with payments timed to avoid seizure. Contracts show these quick transfers. The pattern is unmistakable. Get in when enforcement is weak, operate while margins are fat, get out before the law catches up. That pattern defined Frederick's mobility. He chased booms and abandoned towns. He optimized the cycle of frontier opportunism. Networks mattered. He aligned with liquor suppliers who could front product on credit, with other proprietors who could absorb risk, with captains and logistics men who could move goods quietly. Some relationships were transactional. Others had a texture of patronage. There were occasional threats brawls, debts unpaid, reputations threatened by scandal that had to be managed with both diplomacy and force. The business was a social machine as much as a commercial one. This backstage life helps explain a family pattern, public silence and private accrual. The resources that eventually seeded property investments in Seattle and later funds transferred to New York did not emerge from speeches about hard work and barber's chairs. They came from compressed margins earned in risky, morally gray spaces. That is the practical arithmetic of the story, the arithmetic that family biographies omit because numbers and source documents have a way of disrupting flattering narratives. What drove Frederick was not ideology, and not even a simple pursuit of respectability. It was pragmatic calculation. He saw customers, saw what they would pay for, and built systems to deliver. That pragmatism was neither noble nor monstrous. It was efficient. It produced capital meant to buy a differently respectable future, a house, a wife, a return to community. The return to Karlstadt, when it came, was as much about buying social acceptance as it was about finding comfort. But the past does not let itself be purchased that easily. And yet this backstage world was not invincible. It left traces, ledgers, manifests, letters, local complaints that, once assembled, make a different picture than the one passed down at the parlor table. Those traces would harden into proof when an authority looked closely enough. That look came in 1901. The arrival of inspectors, of letters from Bavarian bureaucrats, of the final demand that would be the moment when the machinery of evasions ran into the immovable object of state record keeping. The question then was no longer whether he could profit in the short term. It was what such profits would cost him when the past caught up. The cost would be larger than fines or shame. It would unsettle an origin myth. And someone, somewhere, had already begun to pull the thread. For months before the confrontation, there were signals small, almost imperceptible like creaks before a house settles. In Karlstadt, officials had a meticulous way of cross-referencing registers. A missing name in a conscription roster looks like an errant stitch once, but if that stitch corresponds to a man returning from America with a new coat and a wife on his arm, it becomes an accusation. Bavarian administrators prided themselves on such pattern recognition. When Frederick returned to his home village in 1901 as a man who had made good, he did not know the register would be read against him. Imagine the estate in Karlstadt on a bright spring day, blooming chestnut trees, neighbors gathered, curiosity and a hint of envy at the Ritterney who had prospered abroad. Frederick arrived with trunks, with polished boots, with a manner that said money could redraw a past. He married Elizabeth Christ in a ceremony that the village would remember with pride. He spoke of America as a land of opportunity. He offered gifts. He bought linens and paid for things with a confidence that transformed glances into compliments. But archives do not flinch at charm. The Bavarian state had records, enrollment lists, military decrees, notes of absence. A clerk compared a birth register, a conscription roll, and a passport application and noticed Frederick Trump was absent where the state expected him to be. There was no comfortable gap here. There was a technical violation of civic duty. His absence had been avoidance, not merely migration. The finding landed like a formal, cold object into the warm social scene in Karlstad. When the investigation formalized, the rhetoric from the state was bureaucratic and precise. It accused not of moral failing, but of dereliction of civic obligation, in the state's language that equaled eligibility for revocation of rights. Frederick's letter to Prince Regent Luitpold, discovered later in archives and punctuated by pleading lines, reads as testament to someone trying to convert wealth into acceptance. "I and my wife would like to regain our German citizenship," he wrote, invoking family and the future. The plea is not about brothels or liquor, it is about belonging. That fact matters. He sought restoration by emphasizing home, not confessing methods. The state, however, was not persuaded by familial appeals. Legal processes were underway. He was seen less as a returning son than as a man who had repudiated his obligations. The verdict was deportation. The humiliation was procedural, not a public lynching but the slow, administrative unmaking of a man's claim to a nation. Instead of a triumphant homecoming, Frederick found himself the subject of an official file stamped and docketed. The state reasserted its authority through ink and paper. The sequence that followed was not cinematic in the melodramatic sense. It was bureaucratic and merciless in its ordinariness. Notices were served. Papers were signed. A pregnant Elizabeth watched as the authorities, agents of a nation that valued record-keeping above sentiment, declared him unfit to be restored. Within weeks, the couple found themselves booked on a ship directed to New York. There was no parade. There was a tidy, bureaucratic erasure. Back in North America, the consequences rippled differently. Frederick had never naturalized in the United States. He had lived and worked in spaces where formal citizenship mattered less than local arrangements. Now, exile in practice, he had to rebuild without the social capital he had hoped to carry back to Karlstad. The return to New York was not the homecoming of a wealthy son, but the arrival of a man who had been officially repudiated by his native land. That repudiation became a hinge in his biography. What this deportation exposed was not a moral transgression in the moralistic sense the family later preferred to avoid, but a collision between two kinds of modernity, a European state that enforced civic obligations and a frontier economy that rewarded opportunism and mobility. Frederick had optimized for the latter. The former compelled him to account for a life he had deliberately left vague. A bureaucratic transcript, a clerk's stamp, trumped the narrative of success he had hoped to trade for acceptance. The immediate impact was practical and psychological. Practically, he had to reestablish himself in cities where immigrant networks were changing and where law and documentation were becoming more consequential. Psychologically, the deportation reframed him in the eyes of his family. The wealthy mister who had returned was now a man with a compromised moral file. That stigma shaped how his son and his son's son would later tell, or not tell, the story. There were deeper financial consequences, too. The timing of property transfers and sales in Yukon and Monte Cristo becomes notable when compared with the legal pressure and reform movements of the era. When police cracked down on vice, when reformers pressured local governments, Frederick liquidated and moved, selling at a premium, packing trunks, transferring assets south. The records suggest not mere luck, but a pattern: leave before the enforcement lands. In one sense, the deportation was the endpoint of a career built on precise timing. But the most consequential effect was reputational. Once the record of deportation existed in Bavarian registries and correspondence, it became part of a fact set not easily scrubbed. The family could ignore it socially in Karlstad, but they could not, forever, hide the paper that said he had been expelled. That tension between the public story the family wanted to tell and the documentation that contradicted it would shape later decisions about memory. After being pushed back to New York, he resumed life without having become an American citizen. He operated in the ambiguous zone of long-term resident and stateless entrepreneur. He remarried into American life, the need to appear respectable in the city, to obtain building permits, bank loans, civic honors, requires a narrative void, a cleared space into which new mythologies can be inserted. The deportation made that void urgent. And there is another sting. When Frederick attempted to frame his emigration as a temporary commercial adventure, not a full departure, Bavarian documents made his evasions visible to any future historian with access to archives. That archival truth would eventually collide with campaign speeches and book passages. The collision would be messy, but at the time, the family did not see an abstract historian's future. They saw immediate survival and the need to consolidate. They reoriented toward property, toward municipal respectability, toward networks of politicians who value donations and civic benefaction above moral inquiry. The strategy worked, at least until the story was needed as a rhetorical device decades later. Then the silence would be weaponized to mean something else. For now, the deportation remained a private wound, pressingly procedural and quietly fatal to Frederick's plans to reclaim a hometown status he had assumed money could buy. It closed one chapter violently and opened another quietly, in New York real estate, in quiet donations, in civic applause. The edges of that new life were already being smoothed, but the seam was visible to any careful reader of the records. The next chapter in this biography would therefore be less about frontier hotels and more about narrative engineering, how to turn an awkward past into a marketable origin myth. That process of manufacture is what follows. The story that arrives in glossy books a generation later is not the one the archives tell. Myths do not coagulate by accident. They are crafted. The sanitization of Frederick's life was not spontaneous nostalgia. It was a deliberate operation and editing of facts into a tale that served a new, higher purpose, social legitimacy. The machine that did the editing had cogs and private letters, public relations, donations, and the slow, patient work of civic assimilation. The first phase of this machine is omission. Fred Trump, the son who built an urban empire in Queens, rarely spoke of the precise provenance of the family's early capital. In public, Frederick was an entrepreneur who had come from Germany and worked hard. In private, the family kept trunks of receipts, manifests, and letters stored away, seldom displayed at dinner tables. Strategic silence can be as effective as a published lie. It invites the listener to accept a simplified story and discourages inquiry by making the real story awkward to raise. The second phase is recoding. The family recoded vice economy profits as hospitality and service. Advertisements for private rooms became in later narratives hotel accommodations. The recoding was aided by the linguistic elasticity of frontier vocabulary. Words like hotel and restaurant could mean a broader set of activities in boom towns, and that ambiguity was exploitable. This linguistic flattening made it easier to tell grandchildren and investors the same story without immediate contradiction. It gave them a vocabulary that seemed respectable at a glance. The third phase is institutional alignment. To build real estate at scale, you need permits, bank relationships, political friends. Fred cultivated both. He gave to charities, joined civic organizations, and cultivated local power brokers. Those contributions bought social capital. They turned whispers into silence and silence into assumption. When your name funds a hospital wing, people are less inclined to ask awkward questions about the source of your seed money. Institutional respectability functions as a covering narrative. Media played its part. As the family rose, journalists wrote profiles that simplified origins into lessons. Immigrant boy works hard, succeeds. Those profiles are immensely marketable. They sell books and political image. The family narrative, polished, entered the culture. In his later books and interviews, Donald Trump retold a version of his grandfather's story as proof that hard work and legal immigration produce success. The distortion is subtle. Legal, in the sense of arriving in an era of lax enforcement, becomes equated with conscientious obedience to civic rules. That rhetorical sleight of hand suited political arguments and campaign slogans. Political utility hardened the myth. Campaigns love ancestor stories that fit a policy posture. The "my grandfather came legally" line is tidy and useful in debates about immigration policy. It frames the speaker as heir to an ideal immigrant who respected the law. But the truth is messier. The archival record shows a man who avoided military duty, who exploited legal gray zones, who exited jurisdictions before enforcement arrived. The political line requires an amputation of those facts. The media echo chamber amplified the sanitized narrative. Friendly outlets repeated the story without archival scrutiny. The mechanics are simple. A PR line circulates. Sympathetic outlets amplify. Critics are accused of partisan motives. The repetition made the myth stick. Over decades, the repeated narrative gained a timbre of common sense. It became the version that children learned in passing conversations, the version that fit an American moral schema of merit and orderly assent. There were attempts at correction. Journalists and historians who dug into the records found private rooms, ads, municipal complaints, and deportation files. They published findings. But the responses followed a pattern: denial, accusation of bad faith, defense by ad hominem. What should have been a debate grounded in public records became then another skirmish in an already polarized media landscape. That reaction had the effect of protecting the myth. If challenges are dismissed as political attack, readers retreat to the comforting narrative. We should pause and be precise about what is contested and what is agreed. The archival consensus supports these points. Frederick left Germany to avoid military service. He operated hospitality businesses that advertised private rooms. Municipal and police records flagged his establishments for liquor and health violations. He sold property and left jurisdictions as enforcement intensified. Bavarian authorities deported him when he attempted to return. Beyond that, motives and moral weight are interpretive questions, and rightly so. But the core records are not disputed by responsible historians. How does a family transform a contested past into a usable origin story? It is instructive to look at the mechanics. First, choose language that compresses complexity into virtue. Entrepreneur instead of vice proprietor. Second, emphasize traits that resonate with broader cultural narratives: self-reliance, industriousness, immigrant uplift. Third, institutionalize the new story through philanthropy, civic honors, textbooks, and media-friendly memoirs. Over time, the sanitized story becomes the available one because it is reiterated and rewarded. There is also deliberate rhetorical deployment. In political campaigns, the sanitized grandfather becomes a proof text: "My family played by the rules." That slogan does heavy lifting because it substitutes ancestry for policy coherence. It simplifies a complex historical moment into a moral parable usable in debates about immigration. When that parable is itself historically inaccurate, the political usage becomes an act of rhetorical manufacture. Propaganda need not be a state-sponsored film reel. It can be 1,000 small choices: which anecdotes to include in a memoir, which archives to show to a reporter, which donations to make to civic institutions. Each choice pushes public memory a degree. Those degrees accumulate. The family that once operated in legal gray zones now sponsors institutions that shape public life. The institutions, in turn, sanitize the past by their mere acceptance of donations. The cycle is circular and quietly effective. The cultural outcome is significant. A foundational story that claims lawful immigration as its moral core is used to argue for stricter enforcement against those who do not fit that myth. Meanwhile, the historical example it invokes does not withstand scrutiny. That dissonance matters. Public policy that rests on sanitized anecdotes rather than complex evidence risks injustice and hypocrisy. The origin myth becomes both shield and sword. Understanding how the myth was manufactured, when those records are set beside the family narrative, a dissonance appears that cannot be smoothed by rhetoric alone. So what do we do with this knowledge? We can do the modest work of retrieving documents and telling them plainly. We can insist that public claims about ancestry be tested against archives when they are used to make policy arguments. We can explore the human stories of women who labored, of communities that paid a moral and sanitary price, of towns that experienced booms and busts without simplifying them into parables. After all the edits and donations, the manufacture of memory ends up raising a public question. When wealth and power depend on a selective truth, what obligations do descendants have to be candid? The answer is not obvious, and that is the point. The propaganda machine succeeded precisely because it traded nuance for narrative. The remaining task is to restore some of that nuance to public understanding. Only then can we see not just a founding father or a family myth, but the broader mechanics of how reputation and policy get made in modern life. The next thing to ask is harder. Given the evidence, how should we reconstruct a more honest, if discomforting, portrait of the man at the center of this story, one that neither sanctifies nor demonizes but explains? That reconstruction is what comes next. When the myth is stripped away and the paper trail is laid on the table, the man who becomes Frederick Trump is not a single, tidy character from a family scrapbook. He arrives, in the record, as a series of practical calculations, where risk is low, profit high, and mobility makes consequences manageable. The honest portrait that emerges is neither hagiography nor cartoon villainy. It is a portrait of a pragmatic opportunist whose choices illuminate the economic and legal scene between the frontier and the settled world at the turn of the 20th century. Start with motive. The archival consensus is clear and simple. As a teenager in Karlstadt, Frederick Trump left Germany to avoid mandatory military service. That fact is not some partisan attack. It is a clerical finding in Bavarian registers. Leaving to evade conscription is not the romanticized seeking opportunity line. It is a calculation about bodily risk, obligations, and personal priorities. For a 16-year-old in a dense patchwork of German principalities, the decision to depart meant renouncing an immediate civic duty in exchange for uncertain freedom abroad. That choice matters because it is the first time he prioritized his own temporal advantage over a legal tie to the state. From there, the move maps easily onto a market strategy. Frontier boom towns Monte Cristo and Washington, later Bennett and Whitehorse in the Yukon, offered a simple business logic. A sudden influx of cash, temporary populations made vulnerable by distance and isolation, and weak, sometimes inconsistent, local governance. That combination generated predictable demand for services often framed as amenities: food, heated rooms, companionship, and alcohol. Contemporary ads and municipal registries are blunt about how those services were presented. The phrase "private rooms for ladies" appears again and again in printed notices. That phrase is not a flourish. It is a recognized euphemism of the era for paid sexual services. The primary documents, business adverts, registries, police logs, use language practical and transactional. Those records form a core of the factual portrait. Sense the place for a moment. Imagine a cold, wind-bitten Main Street where plank sidewalks creak and lantern light drowns the snow in a yellow blur. Men arrive with sacks of gold dust and boots crusted by river silt. The smell is a mingling of coal smoke, grease from cast iron pans, and cheap spirits that burns like fire in the nose. A front room offers hot stew and conversation. A back corridor has the muffled tinkle of coins and the low, professional voices of women paid to make a dangerous town tolerable. The scene is vivid because it is repeatedly documented across contemporaneous sources. That repeatability is what makes the evidentiary case strong rather than anecdotal. Frederick's role in this economy was neither hands-on sexual labor nor some romanticized civic benefaction. He was the organizer and manager. He leased or purchased properties when the boom created upward pressure on prices. He advertised to signal services that would attract the right clientele. He set prices in a market with few substitutes. And he managed exits. When regulations tightened, he sold properties and moved. That pattern: enter when enforcement is lax, extract when the market peaks, leave when the political risk rises is crucial. It's a behavioral fingerprint visible in transaction dates, sale prices, and correspondence. When town councils or police commissioners began to apply sanitary or liquor laws more strictly, evidence shows that he divested. That is recorded in land transfer documents and in reported sales, which sometimes happen suddenly and at a premium. There is another, more intimate dimension to how he operated: compartmentalization. In letters home, Frederick routinely used neutral terms. He described restaurants and hotels and the general prosperity of American life. Those letters are factual. He did run restaurants and lodging, but deliberately vague in the same way a businessman today might omit unsavory revenue streams from a family history. The vagueness was functional. It allowed him to preserve family ties and respectability back in Karlstad, while exploiting categories that the local market tolerated. The archive gives us both the soft prose of personal letters and the blunt ledger entries of municipal and police records. The two documents, side by side, produce cognitive friction: domestic affection on one page, municipal citation on another. That friction culminated, fairly predictably, in his attempt to return to Germany as a prosperous man. He arrives in Karlstad with trunks, a coat, and the posture of a self-made returnee. He courts social acceptance and marries Elizabeth Christ. For a moment, the scene resembles the canonical immigrant success story. A boy becomes a man, sends money home, returns to claim his place. But the state's registers disagreed. Bavarian officials, trained to read registers as evidence of civic patterns, found the absence that converted anecdote into accusation. A missing conscription record matched to absence in the place where he was supposed to have served. The subsequent legal process was bureaucratic and formal, not scandalous in the sensational sense, but devastating in its effect. The charge was not moral theater, it was civic enforcement. He had avoided a legal obligation, and the consequence was revocation of residence. The letter he wrote to Prince Regent Luitpold is a peculiar artifact. Read as a primary source, it is earnest, coaxing language. "I and my wife would like to regain our German citizenship," he pleads, emphasizing family, home, and the pragmatic desire to fold his American fortune into a life in Germany. It's a letter that intentionally leaves out the nature of the fortune. It frames the emigration as temporary commerce rather than final expatriation. That omission is revealing. It suggests a conscious rebranding designed to appeal to the sensibilities of an official who valued lineage and obligation. The reply from Bavarian authorities was not rhetorical, it was administrative. The verdict: deportation. Deportation, in this case, is not the explosive public spectacle we imagine from novels. It was paperwork enacted with mechanical precision: listings, stamps, orders. Yet the effect was a rupture that reoriented the family's future. The couple, pregnant and humiliated in formal ways, boarded a ship back to New York. He had never naturalized in the United States. He returned technically stateless for some practical purposes, functionally reliant on mobility and local networks. That legal limbo shaped subsequent choices: risk management, secrecy, and rebranding. It is tempting to moralize his conduct in broad strokes. The evidence resists such a binary verdict. The records do not show coercive fraud, large-scale violence, or systematic mistreatment of workers. There are, instead, patterns of opportunism that would make modern compliance officers blush. He exploited jurisdictional gaps, used euphemism when needed, and leveraged cash movements to shift advantage. Those are strategic choices, not signs of necessary depravity. They are choices many business people make when regulatory oversight is weak and profit is available. What his actions do reveal clearly is an ethic or lack. That repackaging involved rephrasing restaurants as hospitality, reframing military evasion as seeking opportunity, and emphasizing real estate prudence over the morally ambivalent origins of the seed capital. It is also to acknowledge the limits of the archive. Some questions remain: contested degrees of complicity, the depth of coercion involved in labor practices at his establishments, the precise mechanisms of certain transfers. Those are legitimate arenas of scholarly dispute. But the central facts remain stable: draft evasion, businesses sold as private rooms, regulatory complaints, timely exits, deportation. These are not fringe claims. They are documentary. This is why the renovated portrait is uncomfortable and useful. It refuses the flattening of history into a parable of virtue or vice. It shows a human actor in specific markets behaving according to clear incentives, and then it follows the ripple effects of those incentives across time. When you hear the family origin, "My grandfather came legally," remember that documented life rarely fits neatly into the marketing slogan. History, in this case, is messier than the myth and more informative about how fortunes are actually made. What follows from that honesty is not a simple moral verdict. It is an invitation to understand the mechanics of social assent, the legal gray zones exploited, the social silences enforced, the civic gestures purchased, the donations that smooth over inconvenient origins. Frederick's decisions were personal strategies. The consequences were social machines that later generations would use to translate frontier wealth into institutional legitimacy. That machine silence plus recoding plus institutional alignment creates a usable past. The portrait we reconstruct here aims not to sentence a man 2 centuries gone, but to show the causal chain from one migrant's pragmatic choices to the later public power and civic narratives that those choices made possible. And yet, even in this more honest rendering, a question nags at the edge of the frame. How did a man whose legal status was precarious manage, in a few decades, to convert transient frontier profit into generational respectability? The answer leads directly into the engine of public narrative, the deliberate and often quiet work of rebranding and myth-making that turns an awkward reality into a comfortable origin story. That work is what the next section will follow, from early omissions to institutional alignment, from edited memoirs to political slogans. The machinery is as instructive as the money it polished, and it is about to be opened. The transformation of a messy, marginal fortune into a respectable family brand was not an accident. It was a multi-stage operation carried out across decades, using language, institutions, and gifts as tools of amnesia. If Frederick Trump provided the raw material, liquid capital poured into property, then his descendants supplied the refinery, strategies that turned frontier coin into civic gold. To understand how that happened, follow the 3 simple moves that recur in the archive: omission, recoding, and institutional investment. Begin with omission. Silence is not absence, it is a rhetorical act. Fred Trump, who would build an empire of rental housing in Queens, rarely spoke in detail about his father's early ventures. When the subject surfaced in family conversation or in later pamphlets, those memories were couched in neutral, respectable nouns: entrepreneurial, hospitality, worked hard. In public documents, memoirs, promotional materials, campaign literature, the frontier years appear as a prologue marked by industriousness and resilience, not moral ambiguity. This pattern matches well-documented family behavior and corporate PR behavior elsewhere. Uncomfortable origins are elided, inconvenient transfers are described as prudent investments, and the messy labor that produced early profits is turned inward and minimized. Omission is always easier when the legal framework of the time provides plausible deniability. Frederick's immigration occurred in an era without the formal immigration architecture of later decades. Saying he arrived the right way is technically misleading but rhetorically powerful. The phrase invokes anachronistic categories that appeal to contemporary sensibilities about legality, fairness, and deservingness. Political narratives thrive on such compressions. The second move, recoding, is linguistic and cultural. Words do work. The language of frontier vice, private rooms, houses of ill repute, saloons was replaced with the kinder lexicon of hospitality and service. An advertisement that once promised private rooms for ladies becomes in later retellings a hotel that offered accommodations to minors. The semantic shift is not merely cosmetic. It reframes the actor from profiteer in moral gray markets to service provider in an essential industry. Over time, the recoding becomes embedded in schoolbooks, in interviews, in documentary voiceovers. You see this across the family's published histories. Descriptions thin, ambiguous verbs proliferate, and the reader is invited to imagine entrepreneurial hardship rather than vice capital. Recoding also operates through narrative focus. Emphasize thrift, industry, real estate acumen, to emphasize the origin of initial capital. Teach grandchildren about the skills of running a hotel, how to order linens, how to deal with suppliers, how to manage accounts. Teach them that these are the skills that translate into civic virtue. The human mind naturally fills in the gaps. A family known for civic donations is read as ethically upright. The truth is more complicated. Donations and civic ties are also powerful shields. That leads to the third move, institutional alignment. Money buys access more reliably than it buys reputation. Fred Trump, working in New York, discovered the old social rule. When you fund a hospital wing, you shift the baseline of public curiosity. Institutions accept donations and, in doing so, often become complicit editors of memory. They name buildings, host dedications, and structure local narratives. The family's early philanthropy and civic engagement produced tangible social capital: mayoral dinners, library plaques, local press coverage that functioning as a buffer against deeper inquiry. This alignment extended into politics. The family cultivated connections with local politicians, built relationships with zoning boards, and cultivated the kind of municipal goodwill that turns permit applications into routine approvals. Political allies provide more than transactional favors. They are validators in the public square. A developer who gives to causes and sponsors cultural events wears cloak of legitimacy made of other people's esteem. Media plays a parallel role. Journalists and publishers, often incentivized by access and by narrative demand, prefer tidy stories. A profile that reads like a parable: immigrant boy arrives, works hard, becomes community stalwart sells. Editors like narratives that map neatly onto cultural scripts of meritocracy. That preference is not evidence of malice. It is an institutional inertia that favors simplicity. Over decades, journalists repeated the family's preferred phrasing: immigrant who came the right way, self-made, enterprise. The repetition compacts the story. The compacted variant becomes the easy, default version passed along in sound bites and campaign rallies. Politicians then weaponize the compacted version. The family's immigration story, recoded and institutionalized, became a handy rhetorical device for contrasting good immigration with bad immigration. The slogan, "My grandfather came legally," functions as a rhetorical shortcut, a moral credential that avoids engagement with structural nuance. That line is powerful because it draws on cultural assumptions about legality and fairness. It is, in effect, a talisman. It requires no detail. It needs only to be repeated. When critics and historians later tried to reintroduce complexity, political reporters and archival researchers pointing to the private rooms, ads, the municipal complaints, The deportation files the response often followed a familiar pattern: denial, ad hominem attacks, and institutional defense. If the defense is effective, the inquiry gets polarized. Critiques are framed as politically motivated, and the retort is framed as unpatriotic or hostile. The psychological effect is powerful. Real estate investment is less spectacular than gold dust, but it is more replicable and better suited to intergenerational transmission. The family's ability to convert provisional fortunes into stable, institutional capital depends on access to finance, to networks of contractors, and to municipal markets, precisely the arenas where respectability is most valuable. A sanitized family history lubricates that transition. There are human narratives folded into this machine that are not merely cynical. Descendants sought stability, social acceptance, and opportunity in a world where respectability mattered. They had reasons. They built schools, delivered jobs, and invested in neighborhoods. Those actions have real public value. The analytical task is not to erase the public goods they produced, but to put those goods in the context of origins and mechanisms. How public value and private origin interact matters for contemporary policy debates about wealth, philanthropy, and civic honor. Finally, the machine produces moral asymmetries. When elites convert morally ambiguous beginnings into civic virtue, they acquire rhetorical leverage. That leverage is used in public debates to justify policies that exclude others. That is an ethical problem because it leverages selective memory to make moral claims about who is deserving. The sanitized origin story becomes a club to beat living people trying to gain entry under different historical conditions. Understanding the propaganda machine also suggests remedies. If historical claims are to serve as moral authority in policy debates, they should be tested against archival standards. Public institutions that accept donations should be transparent about history, and media should be encouraged through professional norms and civic literacy to interrogate origin stories when those stories are pressed into policy arguments. The technical fixes are small: footnoting family histories, opening archives, encouraging public historians to contextualize donor narratives. The cultural fixes are larger: reteaching civic virtue as not simply the product of ancestry, but as the outcome of institutions that require accountability. The sanitized family legend did not collapse into the archive because people are cynical or because the facts were unknowable. It persisted because the combination of omission, recoding, and alignment is effective. It is cheap, it works, and it rewards silence with status. Once the myth is embedded in institutions, it acquires inertia. That inertia makes it costly to replace the comforting story with a more disquieting, but truer, version. Yet if the point of historical inquiry is to inform civic judgment, the cost of inertia is borne by the public. The public pays in policies justified by myths and in moral authority claimed by those who can afford to manufacture it. So when you next hear the tidy origin tale invoked as a moral exemplar, ask, which version are you being asked to believe? Whose silence was purchased to make this story comfortable? Who benefits when an origin is recoded as virtue? Those questions cut straight to the heart of how the past gets turned into political capital, and they point to what is really at stake, not simply who Frederick Trump was, but how his story was carried forward and used in the politics and culture of our time. The next step is to take that reconstructed portrait and place it in the present, to trace the ways the sanitized legend shaped policy debates, cultural symbols, and popular memory. That is where the story's consequences become public and where the quiet decisions of one man and his descendants exert outsized influence on national conversations about migration, merit, and belonging. We began with a man who fled a uniform and ended with a family that dressed his fortune in a civic coat of arms. The path from draft evasion, private rooms, and timely exits to hospital wings, zoning favors, and campaign slogans is a lesson in how memory is manufactured, not by accident, but by choice. facts are not enough. They must be narrated, edited, and institutionalized to become doctrine. So here is the question you should carry out of this film. If a foundation myth so central to contemporary political argument can be reshaped so thoroughly despite documents that contradicted, how many other obvious origin stories are quietly serving interests they were never meant to justify? Thanks for staying with this investigation. If you want more dossiers like this, other origin myths taken apart, other foundations examined, subscribe, leave where you're watching from in the comments, and share a story you were taught as a tidy moral that later proved messier. We're building a map of inconvenient truths. Your tip might point us to the next file to open.